We continue now at the top of Daf Yomi Gemara in Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 10a. On the previous summer, there was a machlokes amoraim between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Let's say a person slaughters the animal that's the carbon, and he has in mind at the time of the shechita that he's going to be zorek es dama. He's going to do the zrikas hadam, the sprinkling of the blood, shalo lishma. So it's not that at the time of the shechita he has in mind shalo lishma. It's just that he has in mind that when he does the zrika, it will be shalo lishma. And so that's a machlokes again amoraim, whether in that situation the carbon is disqualified or not. Rabbi Yochanan says psula, it is disqualified, and Reish Lakish says that it is not disqualified in that case. And on the previous summit, the Gemara explained that the machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish is whether we're mechashvin me'avoda li'avoda. Can you have intent from one avoda to the other? And we find by Pigel, for example, that there is a concept of mechashvin me'avoda li'avoda. So Rabbi Yochanan says we learn from Pigel that over here also there's a concept of mechashvin me'avoda li'avoda, and that's why it's disqualified. And Reish Lakish says, no, we don't learn from Pigel, and therefore it is ksher, it is not disqualified. And on the previous summit, the Gemara said that we find this machlokus by Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish in another context, and this is talking about by avodah zara. The Gemara says, hashochet es habehema. Let's say somebody slaughters an animal, al menas lizrok dama la'avodas kochavim, and he's having in mind on condition to sprinkle the blood to avodah zara. Well, lahakter chelbo la'avodas kochavim, or let's say to burn the fat of the animal to avodah zara. So again, it's a similar case. At the time of the shechita, he's having in mind to do the zrika for avodah zara. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Asura. Rabbi Yochanan says it's prohibited because mechashvin me'avoda li'avoda. You can have intention from one avoda to another. V'yalfinan chutz mipnim, and we can learn out something outside of the Beis Hamikdash, like this case of avodah zara, from inside the Beis Hamikdash. Again, like the case of Pigel, which is in the Beis Hamikdash. Reish Lakish Amar Mutaris. Reish Lakish says it's mutter. Ein mechashvin me'avoda li'avoda, because we don't say there's intent from one avoda to the other. V'lo yalfinan chutz mipnim. We don't learn something outside the Beis Hamikdash from something inside the Beis Hamikdash. And the Gemara continues and says, V'iyash minan boha. Now, if I only had this case over here, this case of the avodah zara, so then I would say, boha amar Reish Lakish. It's in this case that Reish Lakish says mutter. Avol penim mi penim. But let's say, in the case we had on the previous summit, where it is also something in the Beis Hamikdash, we're talking about a carbon shalo lishmo. So ema modi leila Rabbi Yochanan. I might say that Reish Lakish admits to Rabbi Yochanan that we can learn from Pigel, and we would say that in fact is disqualified. And the same in the reverse, v'iyash minan ha. And if we had only that case, b'ha kam Rabbi Yochanan, maybe Rabbi Yochanan only said it over there, again, where it's all within the Beis HaMikdash, he said prohibited, avol bahi, but in this case over here, avodah zara, outside of the Mikdash, eima modi leila Reish Lakish, maybe he would admit to Reish Lakish that it's mutter, and so therefore it's tzrichi, therefore it's necessary to have the machlokas in both cases. And Rashi explains, Hashochet es habehema shel chulin la'avodas kochavim. A person, he slaughters an animal, this is not a carbon, he slaughters a regular animal for avodah zara. The general halach is asura bahana, that becomes prohibited to get any benefit from that animal. Kedin zivchei mesim, it has the same halacha as zivchei mesim, slaughterings to the dead. V'zivchei mesim yalfinan sham me'egel arufa, that we learn out from egel arufa. The point is, it is asur bahana, you can't get any benefit. And so in this case, he didn't do it at the slaughtering, but he had in mind lizrok dama la'avodas kochavim. At the time of the slaughtering, he had in mind to sprinkle the blood to avodah zara. Hashchita lo nasis l'shem avodas kochavim. The slaughtering was not done for avodah zara. Ela b'shas shchita chishev la'avod hazrika l'shem avodas kochavim. Just at the time of the slaughtering, he had in mind that he was going to do this zrika for avodah zara, v'lo zarak, but he didn't end up throwing the blood, and so that's the question. So mechashven me'avoda li'avoda, according to Rabbi Yochanan, you can have intention from one avoda to the other, meaning machshava hi le'inyan zivchei mesim la'yasr b'hana. This is considered a real intention, and therefore it's prohibited to get any benefit. Di alfinan avodas kochavim shehi chutz. We learn avodah zar, which is outside of the mikdash. Mimachsheves pigel, from the intention of pigel. Shehu panim, which is inside the Beis HaMikdash. Again, pigel is when you have intention to do it outside, to consume the carbon outside of the proper time frame. Muteres lachil and Reish Lakish, he says no. He said it actually is permitted to eat from this, because ein mechashvin me'avoda li'avoda. You don't have intention from one avoda to the other. Ve'ena asur, it's only prohibited. Elim kein shachad la'avodas kochavim. The only time it would be prohibited is if you actually slaughter it to avodah zara, shebeshchitasa avad avodas kochavim, that through the slaughtering you're serving the avodah zara. O zarak la'avodas kochavim, or let's say he throws the blood la'avodah zara, and so only in those situations would it be problematic. And finally, Rashi says, Penim mi pnim, we would learn inside the mikdash from inside the mikdash. Again, that means machsheve shelo lishmo. That's intention, having a carbon not lishmo. Mi pigel, learning that from pigel. And the Gemara continues, Ki Yasser Rav Dimi Yamar, when Rav Dimi came, he said, Meisiv Rabbi Yirmiyah, L'siyuei l'Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yirmiyah asked the question as a support for Rabbi Yochanan's opinion. V'Rabbi Eila L'siyuei l'Reish Lakish, and Rabbi Eila, he supported Reish Lakish's opinion. Rabbi Yirmiyah L'siyuei l'Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yirmiyah, in order to support Rabbi Yochanan, he said as follows, Uma b'mokom shem amar hareini shochet chutz lizmano. If in a situation where a person says, I'm going to slaughter it outside of the proper time, the halach is shu kosher. The halach is that in that situation, it is kosher. We'll see Rashi in a moment. But shachto al minas lizrok damo chutz lizmano. But if a person slaughters it in order to throw the blood outside of the proper time, that would be a classic case of pigul. So pasul, so that's disqualified. Now, if that's the case, so mokom shemamar hareini shochet shelo lishmo pasul. In a situation, if a person by a carbon says, I'm slaughtering it not lishmo, it's disqualified. So shachto al minas lizrok damo shelo lishmo. So if he slaughters it on the condition to throw the blood shelo lishmo, eino din shi'e pasul. Isn't it logical to say that it would be disqualified? And that's a support for Rabbi Yochanan again, that it's disqualified in this situation of shachto al manas lizrok damo shelo lishmo. Now, on this logic, maskif lo Rava bar Ahiloi asks on this, can you really make this kal v'chomer? Because malach chutz lizmano, because you're learning from a situation of chutz lizmano, meaning you're learning from pigul. But what's unique about chutz lizmano is shekain kares, that involves kares, and so therefore you really shouldn't be able to learn from there. Elo amar Rava bar Ahiloi, rather Rava bar Ahiloi says, hachi kamar, this is the argument that's a support for Rabbi Yochanan. Uma mokom shemamar hareini shochet chutz lemekomo. If in a situation where the person is saying, I'm going to slaughter it outside of its proper place, now in that situation, if it's not chutz lizmano, but if it's chutz lemekomo, that doesn't involve kares. So if a person says, I'm going to slaughter it outside of his place, of its proper place, shu kosher, that's kosher. Shachdo amanas lizrok damo chutz lemekomo, but if a person slaughters it on the condition to throw the blood outside of the proper place, so then pasul, so then it's disqualified. So therefore, again, the same logic, makom shemamar hareini shochet shelo lishmo shu pasul. In a situation like a carbon where when you say that I'm going to slaughter it shelo lishmo, it's pasul, it's disqualified. Shachto amanas lizrok damo shelo lishmo. So if he slaughters it on the condition to throw the blood shelo lishmo, eino din shi'e pasul. Isn't it logical to say that that would be disqualified? But the Gemara again asks on this, Maskif lo Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi asks on this, Ma l'chutz lemekomo. What's unique about chutz lemekomo? Shekein noheg b'chol hazvachim. That's something that applies to all karbonos. Tomer b'shalo lishmo. But when it comes to shalo lishmo, she'eino noheg ela b'pesach v'chatos. That only disqualifies, means to say that only fully disqualifies the carbon by carbon pesach and carbon chatos. Again, like we said in the Mishnah, the other karbonos, they're still kosher karbonos. They just don't fulfill the obligation of the owners. By carbon pesach and carbon chatos, it's completely disqualified, and so therefore, again, you cannot use this reasoning. So Elo Amar Rav Ashi, rather Rav Ashi says, Hachi Kamar. This is the logic that would support Rabbi Yochanan. We say as follows, Uma b'mokom shema Amar, hareini shochet l'shem ploni shu kosher. If in a situation where the person says that I'm slaughtering it for so-and-so, it's kosher, lizrok damo l'shem ploni pasul, but if he says to throw the blood for so-and-so, it's pasul. So mokom shema Amar, hareini shochet shelo l'shmo shu pasul. In a situation where he says, I'm slaughtering it shelo lishmo, it's pasul. Shachto al manas lizrok daman shelo lishmon. If he slaughters it in order to throw the blood shelo lishmon, eino din shi'e pasul. Isn't it logical to say that it would be disqualified? And Rashi explains, Hareini shochet chutz lizmano. If a person would say, I'm slaughtering it outside of the proper time, that's actually kosher, meaning velo chishav al manas lechol. He's not having in mind to consume it, to eat it after the proper time. Velo al manas lizrok, or not having in mind to throw it after the proper time, or lahaktir, or to burn it after the proper time. El al hashchita chishev stam chutz lizmano. Just on the slaughtering, he's thinking outside of the proper time. So kosher, that actually is kosher. The lav machshavi, that's not considered an intention that would be pigul. De'ein zman ela ba'achilas adam umizbeach tezeu pigul. Because when we talk about time by pigul, that's talking about the consumption of the person, when the person's eating the carbon, or let's say the mizbeach, so to speak, is consuming the carbon. That's what pigul is. So pigul would not apply when a person is thinking hareini shochet chutz lizmano. The Gemara then said shekain kares. The Gemara said it's unique. You can't bring a proof from pigul because that involves kares. Rashi says that means ha'ochel pigul, somebody who eats pigul, afilu lialter, even if he eats it immediately. In other words, you had in mind to eat it not at the proper time, but he ate it at the proper time. But once you already have in mind not to eat it at the proper time, that renders it pigul, and therefore chayiv kares, he's going to be chayiv kares for eating the pigul again, even if he ate it immediately. Hoel v'chamer. So since it's so strict, mahan yebe me'avoda li'avoda. Maybe that's why over there an intention from one avoda to the other is effective. And Rashi continues, Hareini shochto chutz lemekomo. He says, I'm going to slaughter it outside of the proper place. Shelo chishav lo al achila v'lo al zrika. He wasn't thinking on the eating or the zrika, the throwing of the blood. Elo amar hareini shochet chutz lemekomo. Again, he says, I'm slaughtering it outside of the place. Kosher, that's kosher. Ta'chazinan devemekomo shochto. We see that he's slaughtering it in the right place. V'yod v'achilas adam amizbeach talarachman. And again, it really should all be dependent in terms of chutz lemekomo, just like chutz lezmano. It's all dependent on the consumption of the person or the mizbeach. L'chutz l'mekomo. That's what we talk about when we talk about chutz l'mekomo, v'chutz l'zmano, and chutz l'zmano. T'chsivim ha'achol ye'ochel, it says consumption. V'alfin on chutz l'mekomo, v'chutz l'zmano, mehai kra. That's the pasuk that we learn out, the idea of chutz l'mekomo and chutz l'zmano, l'kamon later on. Al menas lizrok damo chutz l'mekomo, puzzle. If he says on condition to throw the blood outside the proper place, that would be puzzle. V'hashta lekol l'mifrach shekein kares. And Rashi notes, now you can't ask the question that it involves kares, shein chayavin kares. Because there you're not chayv kares on that consumption in a situation of chutz l'mekomo. And so then finally the Gemara said, shachat l'shem ploni kosher. The halach is, if a person slaughters it for so and so, it's kosher. De'ein shinoi bailim chol al hashchita. We mentioned this earlier. The shinoi bailim, the concept of shinoi bailim as opposed to shinoi kodesh. Shinoi bailim is when you have in mind a different person, not a different carbon. There's no shinoi bailim by the shchita. To lo shayich shem bailim el al hakapara, because the bailim is only relevant, the owner is relevant to the atonement. V'hainu da'amron la'el to shinoi bailim eino b'dalet avodos. That's what we said earlier, that shinoi bailim does not apply by all 4 avodos of a carbon. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Eila l'siyuei l'Reish Lakish. Rabbi Eila, he brings a support for Reish Lakish. Again, Reish Lakish would say that it is kosher in a situation where the person is having intention from the shchita, from one avoda to another avoda. We say, ein mechashvin me avoda li avoda. And so therefore, if the person had in mind at the time of shchita that he's going to throw the blood, shalo l'shmo, according to Reish Lakish, it's kosher. And now we're bringing a support for Reish Lakish. And the support goes as follows. Lo tomar bizrika. You don't need to say anything by zrika. What we're referring to over here is the idea of shalo l'shmo. The idea of shalo l'shmo again applies by all the avodos, by the 4 avodos that are involved when it comes to a carbon, but you don't really even need to say that by zrika. V'teisi mikal v'chomer mi beinaya. Shouldn't we be able to learn it from a kal v'chomer, from the combination mishchita v'kabola, a combination of slaughtering and receiving the blood? Rashi explains, Lo tomar bizrika mechashvin shalo l'shmo d'ravina le'el b'kulu avodos. Again, we said earlier that we had inclusions for every kind of avoda, that there's a concept of shalo l'shmo, that it disqualifies a carbon, but you don't need to write it by zrika, because you can learn it mishchita v'kabola. You can learn it from the combination of shchita and kabbalah. Rashi explains, Uma shchita shekshera bizar pesula. If shchita which a non-Kohen can perform, it is pesula b'shalo l'shma. That's a disqualification when it's shalo l'shma by the shchita. So zrika lo kol shekein, certainly true by zrika. And kiparachtem, when you're going to refute that and say mal shchita, what's unique about shchita, shekein poselas shalo l'shem ochlin b'pesach, that it disqualifies even if it's not for the people who are eating it specifically by carbon pesach, by shchita, kabbalah tochiach. So the receiving of the blood proves the other way. We mentioned these arguments earlier, and so the point over here is you don't need a pasuk to say it by zrika, because you should be able to learn it out from the kal v'chomer of shchita and kabbalah. And so therefore you have an extra pasuk here by zrika. That's the point. So lamai hilchis akasav rachmana. So why did the pasuk write this halacha by zrika? Lomar, it's to say the ein mechashvin me avoda li avoda. Exactly this idea that there is no intent from one avoda to the other avoda, like Reish Lakish said. Rashi explains, the ein mechashvin me avoda li avoda, ella b'shas zrika gufa boy mechashiv. The whole point is that it has to be during the zrika itself that the person has the intention shalo l'shmo. We don't say mechashvin me avoda li avoda. Again, that's a support for Reish Lakish. But the Gemara continues. Maskefla Rapapa asks, "V'dilma de mechashvin me avoda liavoda." How do you know what the pasuk is teaching? Maybe the pasuk is teaching the opposite, that there is intention from one avoda to the other. Rashi explains, "V'dilma lahachi kosve." Maybe the reason why it's written by zrika, lashmeinon ribusa, to teach us a chiddush, de mechashvin me avoda liavoda shelo b'shas zrika gufa. That even if it's not at the time of zrika, you can have intention from one avoda to the other, because you don't need boy mechashiv. It doesn't need to be b'shas zrika that you have the intention. Even if the intention is not during the zrika itself at that time, even if it's b'shas shchita at the time of the slaughtering, that would be machshava. How do you know which way exactly which direction it's teaching. And the Gemara says, no, im kain, if so, if the idea was mechashven me'avoda li'avoda, so lishtok kramine, the pasuk could have just been silent, v'teisi mikal v'chomer de Rav Ashi, and you could have learned it out from the kal v'chomer of Rav Ashi. And so therefore, since there already was a potential kal v'chomer, that's the kal v'chomer we just said above, the support for Rabbi Yochanan, since there was a potential kal v'chomer to say that mechashven me'avoda li'avoda, so therefore if the pasuk is specifically saying by zrika, it must be telling us the opposite, that ein mechashven me'avoda li'avoda. Rashi explains, im kain de mechashven, if it was true that's mechashven, asal ashmin, and that's what we're teaching, so lishto kramine, the pasuk could have just been silent, v'teisi de mechashven mikal v'chomer de Rav Ashi k'dei amran, and we could just use the kal v'chomer we just said above of Rav Ashi, umayim b'mokom shemamar hareini shochel l'shem ploni v'chulu, if in a situation where you say, I'm shechting for so-and-so, etc., again, that was the kal v'chomer of Rav Ashi, so we could have just said that, and so therefore the fact that the pasuk says it, it teaches us ein mechashven me'avoda li'avoda. And the Gemara continues, v'idach, and the other opinion, meaning Rabbi Yochanan, how is he going to argue that the pasuk by zrika is not extra? Again, the whole reason why the pasuk by zrika is extra is because it can be learned out from a kal v'chomer combination of Kabbalah and Shechita, but Parach Hachi, Rabbi Yochanan will refute that kal v'chomer as follows. Malahanach, what's unique about those two, meaning what's unique about Shechita and Kabbalah, Shekein Te'unos Tzafon, they're required to be in the north, v'yeshnan b'chatos hapnimios, and they exist by the inner carbon chatases, and that's not true by Zrika, so you really can't learn out Zrika from those two. Rashi explains, V'idach Rabbi Yochanan Parachachi, Rabbi Yochanan will refute that as follows. The lo nafgal on Zrika mikal v'chomer de Kabbalah Shchita. You can't learn out Zrika from a kal v'chomer of Kabbalah and Shchita, because Malahanach, just like those, again, they are unique in terms of tzafon, in terms of chatos apnimios. Helkach lav kro yiseiru de neilef minei de ein mechashven. Therefore, you don't have an extra pasuk to learn from there that ein mechashven. And the Gemara continues, V'idach, and the other one will respond back, meaning Reish Lakish will respond back to Rabbi Yochanan, that these arguments about Safon and Chatos HaPnimios, Hashtamiyah b'shlamim kaimin, right now we're talking about carbon shlamim, so you can't make those arguments. Rashi explains, Hashta miyos b'shlamim kaiminon, the b'shlamim ksiva machshava shalo l'shmo. It's really by shlamim, that's the source where we have this whole idea of shalo l'shmo. Hilkach matzi l'meilav zrika mishchita v'kabbalah. Within shlamim, you can learn out zrika from shchita and kabbalah. Why? Because v'leka l'mifrach tzafon, you can't ask from the north to shlamim lo b'ay tzafon. There's no requirement of north by shlamim. And also, v'lesnu pnimios, there is no inner ones, so you can't ask about chatos ha'pnimios over there. You can't ask similar to that question. And so therefore, Reish Lakish will say, in fact, you have a situation here where you really could make the kal v'chomer because you can't refute it by carbon shlamim, and therefore you do have an extra pasuk by zrika. And the Gemara continues, Itmar, it was stated, a machlokas amorim on the same issue, the same machlokas Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish we find between Rav Nachman and Rabbah, Shachta l'shma lizrok dama shalo l'shma, if he slaughters it l'shma, but again has intention to throw the blood shalo l'shma. Rav Nachman Amar Psula, Rav Nachman says disqualified like Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbah Amar Ksheira, Rabbah says it's kosher like Reish Lakish, but v'hadar bei Rabbah lagabe Rav Nachman, but Rabbah ended up retracting his opinion and ended up agreeing with Rav Nachman, mikal v'chomer de Rav Ashi, based on the kal v'chomer of Rav Ashi that we just had above. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Rabbi Eliezer Omer Af HaAsham. Rabbi Eliezer says also the Asham, meaning the carbon Asham is just like the carbon Chatas and carbon Pesach. If it's Shalo Lishmo, it is completely disqualified. Tanya, we learned in a Braisa, Amar Rabbi Eliezer says, Chatos Baal Chet, a Chatos is brought for sin. The Asham Baal Chet, and an Asham is brought for sin. Ma Chatos Shalo Lishma Psula, just like a Chatos, if it's Shalo Lishma, it's totally disqualified. Af Asham Shalo Lishmo Pasal, so to an Asham, if it's Shalo Lishmo, it's totally disqualified. Amar lo Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Yoshua said to him, he said to Rabbi Eliezer, Lo imamrid b'chatas shekein dama lemala. What's unique about the carbon chatas is the blood is above. We'll see Rashi in a moment. Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer said back to him, Pesach yochiach. Well, the carbon Pesach proves the other way. Shadamo lemata. There the blood is below. V'shachtu shalo l'shmo pasal. And there also we say that if you slaughter shalo l'shmo, it's pasal. Amar lo Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Yoshua said, Mala Pesach shekein zmano kavua. But Pesach is unique because it has a set time. Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer said back to him, Chatos tochiach. Chatos can prove the other way. There's no set time. Amar lo Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Yoshua said to him, And Rashi explains, Shekain Dama Lamala, the blood is above, again by carbon chatas, it's Dama Lamala Michut HaSikra. That means it's above the Chut HaSikra, which was like a place on the Mizbeach, a line, so to speak, on the Mizbeach. Tetanan Meseches Midos, we learned in the Mishnah Meseches Midos, Chut HaSikra Chogeres Be'emtza, the Chut HaSikra would go in the middle of the Mizbeach, Lahavdil, Bein Damim Elyonim L'Dam Tachtonim. That was the separation between the Dam Elyonim and the Dam HaTachtonim, the blood that was thrown at the Mizbeach on the upper part of the Mizbeach, and that which was on the lower part of the Mizbeach. V'yolef lekamon bin v'hoisa haresh esar chatzi ha-mizbeach haTorah nosna mechitza lahavdil. The Torah gives a mechitza. There's a line that delineates the difference between where the blood that goes on the upper part of the Mizbeach is and the blood on the lower part, and so therefore by carbon chatas the blood is specifically supposed to go on the upper part of the Mizbeach. V'chatas behema nasis lamala. Carbon chatas that's from an animal goes on the upper part of the Mizbeach, tichsibba al karnos, because it mentions over there, it writes the corners of the Mizbeach. V'chein olas ha'of. Now that's true by the chatas behema, which is an animal chatas, and an olas ha'of, which is a bird ola. Kedel kamon, we're going to say that later on. Ushar zvachim. Now other karbonos, shalo piresh bahen, if it doesn't explain by them that it should be the upper, nasin lamata, so they're below the chut hasikra. T'chsiv behu mizbeach, because by them it says the word mizbeach. V'lo ksib behu karnos. It doesn't say karnos, which is the corners of the mizbeach that are on the top. V'kulei mizbeach lekol meimar dehavim mekomon sharei Torah nosna mechitza. You can't say the whole mizbeach it's appropriate, because the Torah does have a mechitza, and so therefore again some of them are damim lamala, some of them are damim lamata, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Yud Amud Beis.